Okay, everybody, thanks for joining us. Folks who love it are here right on time. We're gonna get started in just a moment here with Jared talking to us about short story endings. A few folks might filter in during the course of the session, and that's totally fine. Just reminding you that we are recording this session for our digital archive, so just be aware of that. All of your smiling faces are appreciated, and if you can't be on camera, that's fine too. But I'm Emma Eisenberg here with Stoop, and it's nice to see everybody. Some people I know, some people I don't. And today we have Jared Levy, wonderful Philadelphia citizen, and also writer and MFA candidate Warren Wilson. His work has appeared in many illustrious places. So have a great session, and thanks for joining us, Jared.
Awesome. Thanks, Emma. So thanks, everybody, for joining on this 4 o'clock on a Wednesday. This is a class that I'm developing as part of my graduation requirements for my MFA. So thank you for being my guinea pigs. I hope you get something out of this that helps you in whatever kind of literary pursuits you have. Perhaps this will deepen your reading if you are a reader. And if you're a writer, one of the things I had put as part of the description is that, you know, if you're bringing a story that you've struggled with the ending, and by the way, like, this is why I'm interested in this. I struggle with endings. I hope that out of this, you might gain some ideas. So I have a PowerPoint to accompany this, and I also have some videos that I'm going to show. So this is called forming an ending from the beginning. And where I'm going to begin is with the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Has anybody seen this movie? For all of these things, by the way, caveat spoilers. You can't talk about the endings of things without doing spoilers. So this is going to be full of spoilers. Anyways, brief description of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. If this is the first time you're hearing of this. This is how it's described. A comedic send-up of the grim circumstances of the Middle Ages as told through the story of King Arthur and framed by a modern-day murder investigation. When the mythical king of the Britons leads his knights on a quest for the Holy Grail, they face a wide array of horrors, including a persistent black knight, a 3-headed giant, a cadre of shrubbery-challenged knights, the perilous castle anthrax, a killer rabbit, a house of virgins, and a handful of rude Frenchmen. Where I'm going to begin our ending is at the point at which King Arthur's men are rallying behind him for what appears to be an epic final battle scene. I just want to make sure that actually I'm sharing the audio as well. I was saying I'm a teacher, and I've often made the mistake of doing share video, share audio. So here we go. This is the ending of Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
French person, today the blood of many a valiant knight shall be avenged. In the name of God, we shall not stop our fight till each one of you lies dead, and the Holy Grail returns to those whom God has chosen. Charge! Come on, come on, move along. Here, Rob, come on. Come on. This one. Come on. Put him in the van. Get a blanket over that one. Come on, Jack. Right back. Come on. Come on. Come on. Put out of my ass, an offensive weapon, that is. Come on, back with them. Back. Right, come on. All right, Sonny, that's enough. Just pack that in. What?
And that's it. That's how it ends. So when I was a kid, learning funny things through watching movies that I thought to be influential and funny, I was so disappointed with the ending. I just kept waiting for the moment when something was going to happen besides what happened. And I thought that now in my writerly age, I find that even still it's a postmodern ending that is almost too clever. And so the Hollywood Reporter actually had the following quote from the creators. Monty Python and the Holy Grail famously ends abruptly from King Arthur. Chapman is arrested by police just minutes before a final cinematic battle. However, according to the Times, Palin's draft scripts show that this decision was only made to cut costs and that a mighty fight was due to take place between the Knights of Camelot, the French, and also the Killer Rabbit, a much-loved character from a previous scene. On the one hand, this ending is pretty consistent with Monty Python and the kind of shenanigans that they're usually up to in their storytelling. And I also think that some people probably love this ending. And that's the thing about endings. They're highly subjective. But with that in mind, I'm going to show you one of my favorite endings of a story of the last, probably 5 or so years. And it's the ending of the series, The Watchmen. So this is based on the celebrated graphic novel by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. The exciting and dark Watchmen takes place in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 34 years after the original story. After a white supremacist attack on the local police department, which leaves only 2 surviving cops on the beat, laws are passed that allow the cops to hide their identities behind masks. One of these cops, Angela Abar, adopts the identity of Sister Night and fights racists while dealing with the decades-long legacy of the vigilantes. So where this ending picks up is that Angela has a conversation that basically her husband, who happens to be the most powerful being in the universe superhero, kind of let everybody down. He didn't really do enough to change things. But lo and behold, as Angela's kind of cleaning up the pieces of this broken family and broken life, she finds within a carton of eggs 1 egg, and she remembers a conversation that she had with her husband, this extremely powerful being, and this is where it goes from there for the ending of this series.
So that's the thing you can do? Give someone your powers?
I suppose I could transfer my atomic components into some sort of organic material. If someone were to consume it, they would inherit, as you call them, my powers.
So, you could put them in this egg, and if I ate it, I could walk on water?
Theoretically, yes.
I just realized that they both do a kind of not fade to black, but black screen in the end, and both leave you with a kind of feeling like, is this it? But there seems to be a difference, at least for me, with the ending of The Watchmen, where it's this is it, and I'm thrilled. I love this ending, and maybe it's because I'm a little bit older and a little bit more of like a grizzled storyteller person, having ingested stories throughout my life, but it's ambiguous, I think, for the right reasons. Ambiguity can be aligned with indecision, but here it's not indecision. I think that showrunner Damien Lindelof puts it best. And if you've like Damien Lindelof, if you've watched some of the other things like Lost, you know that he's had some disappointing endings. So one of the things he had said is one of the really difficult parts of plotting any television show, and I think this applies to storytelling too, let alone one called Watchmen, is that the characters have to have plans. Plans are tough because they're plotty, they're narrative. I feel like I'm much more comfortable when I'm in a space talking about emotion, overcoming trauma, living with grief, or trying to connect with someone you love. Those sorts of challenges come a little bit more naturally to me than constructing plot. He had a lot to say. He loves talking about his work, and he had some other really brilliant things to say about the ending. Those were all the plot machinations we were dealing with coming into the finale. At the end of the day, one of the things we seeded into the season was the egg motif, the idea of fertility. So that egg, according to Lindelof, it's important that it's coming back in the end. Another quote, if ending number 1 is she walks on water, and her number 2 is she sinks to the bottom of the pool, then number 3 is we stopped right before her foot hits the surface of the water. Ending 3 felt like it was the best ending. And I think that's something too that we have to think about with our endings is we could show more always, but why do we stop when we stop? And here he felt like stopping at the point before walking on water was the best point. 2 more. It's just that it feels like a good place to end the story. Both stories moving forward are less entertaining than ending in that moment of choice. And finally, ultimately, origin stories are told in multiple phases. Bruce Wayne's parents are murdered, and that's part of his origin story. But he actually doesn't decide to dress up like a giant bat and fight crime until much later in life. Superman leaving the destroyed planet of Krypton as a baby is part of his origin story. But the more significant part is when he decides he's going to leave Smallville and fight for truth, justice, and the American way, whatever those things are. For Angela, phase 1 of her origin story was the loss of her parents, her upbringing in a Vietnamese orphanage, and then the subsequent loss of her grandmother. But the second phase of her origin story is these 9 episodes, all leading up to that moment of what happens when her foot hits the surface of the pool. So I'll pick up now with this presentation that I have to accompany this class, and I'm happy to share this if interested. It's also something of a work in progress, but that's the image, you know, the water, the foot before it hits the water. And he spoke about this in Vulture. This is not me saying what happens when her foot hits the water. There's certainly 2 possible outcomes, but if you watch the entire season again, or if you look at the poster for Watchmen that existed 15 weeks ago, our intention is clear. That's all I'll say. And it's really that final quote that got me thinking a lot about story endings. It shows just how well Lindelof knows his story. Beyond his understanding, his final quote is saying, you want the answer? Go back and watch the whole thing. And I think that's what great endings do. They return us back to the beginning. Both of the stories, Monty Python and the Holy Grail and Watchmen, contain lots of humor. And stories with humor are the stories I love. They're the stories I write too. So in addition to these two examples from film, I'm going to be going to literature with two short stories, one Atoms by George Saunders and the other Carpe Diem by Lucia Berlin. Those stories are available if you go to the Blue Stoop event page. There are links to those. I hit my New Yorker limit of views, I guess. And so there's also a version of Atoms on, I think it's the Rumpus. I move on now to these stories. So, when you look at the beginning of your story, whatever your story is, but I think especially those stories you struggle with, there are 4 questions that I think are really important to ask yourself at the beginning of your story. How does it begin? Who's introduced? What's the situation? And are themes emerging? I want to take a moment, and if you have a story that you brought, or if you're coming now realizing, hey, maybe there's a story I could bring into the mix here. I'd love if anybody has an example, if they could maybe speak about a story they're working on and perhaps how that story begins. And if anybody does have one, you can use the hand function, and happy to have you talk about it. This is kind of a discussion, if you'd like it to be. Yeah, Julian.
Hi there. Thanks for this class.
Sure.
So I guess should I just like try and answer the questions about what I'm working on, or?
Yeah, I'd love to hear like what's the story you're working on, and you know, it's always hard, right? Because we have stories and they're about a lot of things, but maybe just a little bit about its aboutness, like what the story is doing, and then maybe a little bit more going into its beginning.
Yeah, so I'm only about 3 pages in, so I don't have an ending formulated yet. And I didn't really plot it out or anything. So I was started from a writing prompt from a class I'm taking with Blue Stoop. And the prompt was to start the story with "the neighbors were at it again." And so from there, it starts with the story of someone who realizes he can hear his neighbors having sex through the wall. And he and his boyfriend start to eavesdrop and get a little weirdly invested in their situation until the sound stops, and it somehow ends up ruining the main character's and his boyfriend's relationship because the sound is no longer available to them. So at this point in the story where I've stopped writing, the main character is trying to decide if he wants to or how he wants to intervene to try and save his relationship by maybe tracking down the missing neighbors or figuring out what happened to them or something like that.
That's awesome. That's like such a fun story idea. And I love that prompt. And it's auspicious that that's the prompt, because in a way, if you're familiar with Atoms by George Saunders,
yeah,
that story has a lot to do with neighbors and the activity that they that they're aware of each other, what they're aware of each other's activity. So, okay, so it sounds like you've got the neighbors are at it again. They're having sex on the other side of the wall. There's a couple. The situation is that the sex on the other side is like good for their relationship. Is that right? And it stops, and they're like trying to get the spark of that back.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. And I wonder, you know, that 4th question, maybe it's not there for you yet, but what do you think about those themes that seem to be emerging from your story so far?
I mean, one obvious one is voyeurism, and about the things we do to try and preserve relationships that it maybe aren't built on anything.
Yeah. Yeah, nice. Cool. And like, I think you know, obviously, as you continue to write the story, you'll probably come across other themes, other complications. That's what happens. And the process you're describing, I think, of just kind of taking a prompt and going, like, I've done that a lot of times. And that's, in fact, one of my favorite ways to write a story. So, and usually I think, too, why this issue of endings comes up is that if we do have that kind of organic writing process where we're just kind of going with making, you know, choice after choice, we find ourselves at some point and we're like, how did I get here? And is this the right place for my story? So that's a great example. And if you're cool with it, we'll come back to you in the end to talk about it. But with these questions in mind, I want to consider the thesis that I'm putting forth, which is that the best endings often emerge naturally from the story itself. These endings open the story up to wider possibilities and interpretations, both suggesting territory beyond the story while looking back to the body of the story. So we're going to unpack that as we go through here. But I want to offer a few caveats. One, this class will explain how that works by looking at strong story endings and stories that deploy humor, because I often write using humor, and that's what is helpful for me thinking through this, how it works in stories that use some form of humor. And I think it's helpful to kind of narrow down our stories. There's so many different kinds that I wanted to narrow the field a little bit. And also consider, like, do those kind of stories have their own special set of considerations that we need to keep in mind if we're writing humorous stories? Second caveat, I'm going to look at one high concept humorous story with something of a straightforward ending with Adams, and one story where humor is an element in the story, though perhaps not the primary element. And it's the story that opens up at the ending, Carpe Diem by Lucia Berlin. Last caveat, these are two shorter short stories because I often like to write in the short story form. So I would say anywhere from, you know, well, not 0, but maybe not 3, but, you know, from 500 to maybe 2,000 words. I like reading this form. It happens to be convenient for the purposes of analysis to talk about these short stories. And these also have a lot of pressure, I think, to have good endings because the length draws added scrutiny to every part of the story. All right, so story number 1, Adams by George Saunders. And it's a high concept humorous story. And if you're not familiar with that terminology, what it means is that it's a humorous kind of story with a single, rather easy to articulate premise. For example, there's a story by the writer Edgar Carrot called Fatso, and you know, un-PC terminology, but it's like, you know, this is kind of in his word, like a hot babe turns into a gross guy, and the premise could have allegorical implications, and it could often, and it could and often is the basis of a jokey idea. The beginning of Adams is that Adams, there are two neighbors as pictured on the right, Roger and Adams. They're engaged in a conflict with escalating violence inflicted by the protagonist, Roger. I'm guessing he's the one on the left, but that's just totally a guess. The story gets right into the action and opens up with the following line. I never could stomach Adams, and then one day he's standing in my kitchen in his underwear, facing in the direction of my kid's room. So I wonk him in the back of the head and down he goes. The first lines of that story, and it kind of gets into it. So Using those same kind of questions that we can ask of our own stories, I thought, what if we apply those to the beginning of Adams? And we could ask this of any story, but how does it begin? I doesn't like Adams. We don't know at this point that it's a guy named Roger, but I doesn't like Adams, his neighbor. In fact, we don't even know that it's a neighbor. So it's just that I doesn't like Adams. Who's introduced? There is an I and there is an Adams. What's the situation? Adams is in the home of I, in his underwear, in the kitchen of I, facing in the direction of the kids of I, and I wonks him. What themes are emerging? I think interpersonal conflict is one, violation of privacy. There's a lot of sinister undertones in this story. So pedophilia, revenge, meeting violence with violence. And I suppose that this question is interesting if you haven't read the story. So for anybody perhaps that hasn't read the story, what kind of assumptions might you make about the ending? Like, just based on this beginning, is there something that you think has to happen in this story by the end? Anybody has a gut feeling about how they think this story has to end? Well, one of the things that I think this is, you know, a rhetorical question. If you've read the story, it seems as if this conflict is going to come to a head in some way, right? I never could stomach Adams. Then one day he's standing in the kitchen and he's facing in the direction, so I wonk him. Well, something's going to happen between these two people, right? And in the end, we assume some kind of moment in which they're going to perhaps confront each other, perhaps like Monty Python in some kind of final battle. Adams is structurally a story about an escalating conflict. It has something of a joke structure with repetition and then one final move that takes the story into the stratosphere of bad behavior. After Roger wonks Adams for breaking into his home and being near naked facing his kids, Roger takes additional action, breaking into Adams's home and wonking him some more. But he does not stop at that. Suspicion leads him to make flyers warning the neighbors about Adams, and Roger also breaks into Adams's home for a second time and steals all his weapons. He does this so Adams won't take revenge, but again, he's not satisfied. Finally, he breaks into Adams's home for a third time and takes all the chemicals before being attacked by Adams and his family. He justifies all this by imagining how Roger will likely be thinking. But what he really imagines is his own distorted thinking. The story ends with Roger fleeing after lighting a bag of chemicals on fire. Like many humorous high concept stories, it seems to take an idea to its logical extreme. And there is a penultimate moment in which Roger thinks about his family. This is a change in tone and language. So this is the ending, the final parts of this story. Roger lights the bag on fire and flees. This resolves the action of the story, but as the previous analysis indicates, it doesn't necessarily resolve the story. Saunders wants more than a wild tale of revenge and violence. The stories usually have a lot of heart, and this one gives one more glimpse into Roger's heart with the final line, "And I began to wonk, and once they had fallen back with Adams and his teenage boy huddled over the littlest one, who had unfortunately flown relatively far due to a bit of a kick I had given her, I took up my lighter and fired up the bag of toxics, and made for the light at the top of the stairs where I knew the door was and the night was and my freedom and my home. And I don't know, I have a reading of this where I'm kind of sympathetic to Roger. At least I feel some sense of empathy with him, though you can have a pretty deeply cynical reading of this, as my supervisor has. And I'm down for that too. But how does it end? It ends with lighting a bag on fire and fleeing for home, an escalated act of violence from the beginning dislike of Adams. Who's in the ending? Adams and his family are present in the house, but really just I, Roger, fleeing. We're centered back on the main character, the narrator. What's the final act? Going home, the site of the initial violation of Adams, by Adams. What themes are returned to? We see the return to interpersonal conflict, a violation of privacy, revenge, and meeting violence with violence. And what we gain from this ending, other than the resolution of the plot perhaps, is that Roger imagines himself to be returning to a safe haven. Home may have greater significance, or I call this the Deborah Reed, my supervisor. Roger is truly delusional and dangerous. He uses the idea of home to justify violence, just as our country uses the idea of democracy or other things that sound wholesome and good to justify violence. If anybody listens to the podcast New Yorker Fiction, which I highly recommend, it can have great craft lessons kind of smuggled into the format, which is one writer reading the story of a previous New Yorker writer's story. And in this case, it was Joshua Ferris who read Adams by George Saunders. And he talked about how, and I never would have gotten this otherwise, but if you take the S at the end of Adams and move it to the front, you get something close to Saddam. And this story was written in the aftermath of 9/11, in the midst of the war on terror. And so it can be read in that allegorical mode of something of like a larger critique of perhaps the United States and that kind of tit for tat suspicion, like the suspicion about weapons of mass destruction. So reflection so far. Adams shows you can escalate to the highest point of conflict in your story. Many elements from the beginning are present in the ending, but taken to their extreme. This offers one model of ending informed by the beginning. Take it to the limit. Keep pressing into the conflict, but also remember what's at the heart of the story. Take what you came with. Okay, so that was Adams by George Saunders, the humorous high concept story. And the second story that I have to consider with its ending is a story that uses humor, but opens out. And I'm going to kind of define what that means. I also had a supervisor throughout my MFA program who had the following to say about this story and what makes for good story endings. And he was really an inspiration for this entire class and kind of helped me a lot when it came to the idea of how to end my stories. So of Carpe Diem, he says, it tells a story, it tells a sort of moral story without any hint of moralizing, but it simply lets the story unfold and finds its way naturally to its ending. It's a simple ending without any grandstanding or actual punch or anything like that. But it has that sense of opening out, of life being revealed, expanded, in the way it refers back to its early causal statement about panicking on the BART, which we'll talk about what the BART is, but something has happened in this brief encounter. these brief pages that can only be fully appreciated by reading the story. So this is the beginning of Carpe Diem by Lucia Berlin. I should also say Lucia Berlin is a writer that I feel like doesn't get enough, like she's great, she's really great. And if so, if you haven't read her before, her collection on the right, A Manual for Cleaning Women, is excellent. So many good stories in that, and this story appears in that collection. Most of the time, I feel all right about getting old. Some things give me pang, like skaters, how free they seem, long legs gliding, hair streaming back. Other things throw me into a panic, like BART doors, a long wait before the doors open after the train comes to a stop. Not very long, but it's too long. There's no time. If I remember correctly, BART doors, that's like the subway system in San Francisco, I think. So that's what the BART is in reference to. So these are the questions that we can ask of any story, and we ask them at the beginning of Carpe Diem. How does it begin? It's reflections on aging. This shares similarity with, I mean, you could tell the prose style is very different. The concerns of the story are very different, but this just so happens to be another story that's written in the first person point of view, but without kind of announcing who that I is. So it's just I, and it actually just stays I. What's the situation? Feeling about aging with the examples of skaters. There's a pang, and the BART doors, they throw I into a panic. What themes are emerging? Aging, nostalgia, memory, anxiety, time or lack thereof, needing to leave, and feeling trapped. I left in my rhetorical question here. What assumptions can we make about the ending? Something learned about aging, perhaps, something about death. I mean, given that she is talking about, or I suppose that later we learned that I is a woman who is older. She's going through menopause. Her laundromat attendant really bonds with her over the shared experience of menopause. You know, because we're starting with this moment of the anxiety of aging, we probably assume that some terminus of aging is going to happen, like death, or perhaps like some existential moment that frees one from that anxiety about death, something that would come back to that theme, perhaps. So with the beginning, I'll now kind of go into where the story goes, in case you haven't read it, or summary if you have read it. Throughout the rest of the story, people are in a hurry. Our protagonist goes to the laundromat and accidentally puts quarters in the wrong machine and pisses off a man. The man at the laundromat is in a hurry and becomes enraged when our protagonist slows him down by running his machine again. I have to thank this story for introducing me to the phrase Jesus wept, which the man at the laundromat says numerous times to the woman, something meaning like Jesus wept, like, yeah, so what? Everybody's got problems. His rage is contrasted by the protagonist's low-level embarrassment and shame. She too is trying to get her laundry done in a reasonable amount of time, but there's no space for her disappointment as the man swallows up all of the emotional space. It's a very effective portrait of toxic masculinity. She's forced to leave with wet clothes that she hangs back at home. So the ending. Remember, this one, as I said, opens out and really digging into that idea I think is going to be beneficial to us when we consider an alternative to what otherwise might be a kind of straightforward idea. What do we do with our plots? We take it to the limit, we find like the absolute extreme, and we end at the extreme. This is different. In the end, we come back to the doors. There's symmetry there, which is by its nature, a simple structure. The doors bookend the story. We start with them and we end with them. And of course, doors by their very nature open out, usually without grandstanding. That is the second part of the definition that I'm covering here. It's not like the protagonist says at the end of the story, no more trips to the laundromat. I'm not gonna hang out with that asshole. I closed the door on that situation. It's not that clever. It's not that punchy. No, she's reflecting back on this time in her life where she was in this consuming event and considers how she can have a different emotional position to that element that she talked about in the beginning, barred doors. So, questions to ask about the ending of Carpe Diem. How does it end? At home, with laundry, not in a rush, a different sense of feeling than the beginning. Who's in the ending? It's just the protagonist alone reflecting. That too has symmetry. It's the same as where we started. What's the final act? Reflecting without worry. This is a change because in the beginning, her reflections seem to have with them a sense of anxiety. What themes are returned to? Nostalgia, memory, anxiety, time or lack thereof. Any new revelations? Something about this encounter made the protagonist feel less of a need to rush and feel less panic. And looking at this ending, I think about just how much I do what I'm kind of talking about in this class, which is I want to read it again. I want to really understand why this protagonist had the emotional resolution that she claims to have. Like I'm looking in that encounter to try to find more. And I think that's brilliant. And I think that's what we want from our stories. Like we don't want them to just be this thing that people pick up and throw away. We want them to kind of linger with our audience. So it comes back to questions to ask yourself about your story ending. How does it end? Who is in the ending? What's the final act? What themes are returned to? Are there any new revelations? I would feel bad, Julian, putting you on the spot, being like, now end your story, doing all these things. But hopefully, Julian and anybody in this class who has that story they're struggling with, you can consider these questions. There's certainly questions that I've asked myself as I'm working on my ending, trying to get it right, and especially in those kind of short stories. It's possible that your story will depart wildly from your beginning, like Monty Python, but hopefully you found the end of a story when you're writing a story, your story. And when you're stuck, my advice is always go back to the beginning. And the name of this talk at one point was going to be that will bring us back to you know, that song from The Sound of Music, you know, it's kind of like in the round and you know, there's something a little silly, but yeah, this kind of ended shorter than I thought, which is cool because maybe we could just talk about things if you'd like. I'm available now. And if you want to talk more about story endings that you like, story endings that you don't like. Another thing that I had thought about with this class was like, I'm really curious what story endings people like, because I do think it's highly subjective. And I can think of a lot of different like contemporary examples where the very ending of the thing generates as much discussion as perhaps the whole thing itself, like the ending of Sopranos. And you know, that one's a true litmus test of how people feel about certain endings, because some people think that's a great ending, some people think it's super disappointing. But that's what I got. Thanks, everyone. And I see maybe, oh, I didn't get a chance to look at the chat. What's the podcast called again? Yeah, it's called The New Yorker Fiction. And that there is an episode that goes into atoms, and I highly recommend it. It's really good. And I'm sorry if there was like a problem with my audio. That's something I kind of need to sort out. Oh, yeah,
Thanks so much, Jared.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, I'm just gonna jump in. Oh shoot, I forgot my question. Hold on, let me mute and I'll come back to it.
All good.
Thank you so much. Oh, go ahead.
So sorry. I figured out what it was. So this idea of coming back to your beginning has really always bothered me, because I'm always like, what does that really mean? So these questions are really helpful. It's really more just of a statement. I appreciate the questions, because I can see how like going back to those questions at the end will kind of like let me look at all the parts and see how to kind of arrange them.
Yeah, it's definitely not like an easy fix for your endings, right? Because like, especially I think, well, I also, as I mentioned, you know, I think this works for a kind of story. I don't think it works for all stories. There's certainly stories that depart significantly from their beginning. There's a story that I had considered for this class. It's called Helping by Robert Stone. I don't know if anybody's read it. It was also in the New Yorker. And it begins with a vet who is a psychologist who works in Boston, and it's a slushy day. And by the end of the story, he's in this snowscape where he has a gun, and he is potentially going to do something really like dangerous with his neighbor. And there's this sense of foreboding and like fear. And it really is like a very different emotional register from the beginning. But there's also, I think, some thematic resonances happening. So I think that's always kind of a thing. Like, even if it's not like this perfectly symmetrical design, I think that the thematic part is really helpful. Just to consider, what have you been seeding from the beginning? Like what they say in Watchmen, right? Like, we've been putting an egg in the beginning. Like, this was always kind of going to come back to this moment. And it's kind of brilliant. I also think there's like a little thrill as a reader when you're like, oh yeah, that thing is coming back. You know, it makes you feel smart as a reader for having like picked up on that in the beginning of the story. Which is all to say, I'm sorry, it's going to be hard. Endings are really hard. It's always going to be really tricky to figure it out.
Is it okay? Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah,
hey,
totally.
Hey, Jared, Alicia, I thank you for all of this. And I put a comment in the chat a while ago, like asking how old you were. And I just wanted to really, I was just giving you shit. I was just trying to be funny. You called yourself old and grizzled. And I was like, wait, so I just want you to know, I wasn't that wasn't all me trying to question your intellect. It was just me giving shit for calling yourself. No. I just want to clarify that, because I didn't want that to be like someone.
No, all good. I guess that one of the things I was going to also consider talking about with this class is that, like, I have this vivid memory of being a kid, going to the library, just taking out movies. And I think that was like the earliest form of like learning about stories. I would just watch movie after movie. And that's why I kind of have two examples from like film and television. And I think that, like, you know, you take a different positionality to storytelling when you're making stories. And there is something that I think happens, especially when you're crafting your ending, where you feel almost like jaded about like storytelling, like regardless of age, it's just kind of like, you know, like, hasn't this been done before? Or is this too trite, or is it too sentimental? Or so like, I feel like we're always kind of in this position with our own stories where, you know, I like to come back sometimes as well as to the beginning, like the beginning of what I loved about stories. Like what made me really joyful to like read a story and like hear a story. So I almost would also recommend with story endings is like, think about like where your joy is like in storytelling, and you know, for all of us around stage, try not to be too cynical about stories, because you know, I think there's, especially like when we're just encountering stories for the first time, and I was pretty young when I watched Monty Python. I never like seen that kind of postmodern move. And so I think a part of it too is I was just like really upset. I was like, what? Stories can't do this? But of course they can. Like they can do anything. So like, I just thought at that age, like a contract had been broken between me, viewer, and Monty Python creator. Yeah, but now I know that you can kind of do anything, and it's okay, I guess. Or you know, you want to do something, I think, that makes the viewer feel good in the end. Some people like the end of Monty Python. I don't know. I didn't take it personally. I didn't take. I'm 34.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions. Fun to just talk about stuff. Hey, Elise.
Hey, Jared, thank you so much for this. I was really excited when I heard you were teaching this class, because I thought, oh my gosh, he's great at endings. I can't wait to find out. I admire your work so much, and I can think of several stories of yours that the endings are just brilliant. So thank you for that. But when you're, and I'm really interested in this idea of asking yourself, why do you stop when you stop?
Yeah.
So in your own work, how do you know, like, okay, this is it. Like I've reached the end of this trajectory, especially when you're working with really short pieces too. That's so tough.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I reference Watchmen because I was just like, I was kind of like blown away by that ending. And when I had read that Lindelof thought that, like, you know, if this story were to continue, it would be a new story. And I think that's kind of like the question sometimes you have to ask yourself, like, like where I'm ending, is there more, whatever more to say there is, because of course there's always more to say. I think, like, even if their story ends in death, I suppose, like there's plenty of stories that consider the afterlife, and you know, if it's not in the spiritual realm, whatever. But that's all to say that, like, you could write more, and when you look at what you write more, does it look like the continuation of that story, or does it look like a new story? I think it's a lot easier in the case of the high concept story structure that I was talking about, because you do kind of find your logical extreme in those kind of stories. So you push it to the limit, you take it to some place, you know, Adams, it's like, I don't know what happens. I mean, I guess what happens after that is not the story of revenge between Adams and Roger, but the story of consequences, which, thinking about it, if it's an allegory for the war in Iraq, like, you know, there's a lot to say about the aftermath of tit for tat, and there's the aftermath of war, and the aftermath of escalation, and the meeting of violence with violence. But it's a different story, I think. I mean, it certainly could be encompassed in the same story. I don't know, but then the story might have to start like differently, because it seems to begin with the act, and it terminates in the most extreme form of that act. I think with Lucia Berlin's story, you know, she comes home from this event, And it appears that this story, which is being told as a recollection, as a memory, is pretty contained in the sense that she's had some kind of thing that she's learned from that event. So that's another kind of thing that makes the ending make sense, because it's all kind of contained within the revelation of the event. I suppose that for your more like plotty, if one has a more plotty story with a lot happening, you do have to keep in mind, I think you do have to keep in mind your beginning. I think you have to really ask yourself, like, what kind of contract did I make with my reader at the beginning of this story about what they're going to read? The terms of that contract can change, certainly, but I think that our readers probably really like when, like I said, like when they feel smart and when they feel like, I was with you in the beginning, you've taken me, we've all taken these things with us along the way, and here we are at the ending, and we've got these things we took from the beginning. If we start taking more and more things at the end, then like that gets like too much baggage, you know, like we're too overloaded with stuff. So I think that's important too, maybe finding the threads and individually, if it's more plotty, if that makes sense. Drawing out like the string of each element.
Yeah. Oh, that's so helpful. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, totally. Again, I don't know. I'm trying my best here. I mean, I honestly feel like a lot of times, you know, I will look back on endings and yes, feel good sometimes, but then it also again, it's highly subjective, I think. Because maybe it goes to the contract that like different readers come into stories with different expectations or desires or thoughts about how stories end based on how they begin. Thanks for coming, Elise. Thanks for coming, everyone. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. And thanks, Julian, for sharing your work. I'm really looking forward to seeing that story somewhere someday. It sounds awesome.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Jared. We're like right at the 5 o'clock mark pretty much, but give Jared some virtual applause, and thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Yeah, we're here every week. bluestoop.org if we don't know you. Nice to see some familiar faces, and hope to see you all next week.
Yeah, thanks, Blue Stoop, and thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Good
Bye.
you.